Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, theirs.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she, her.
I'm Sally Frank, a professor of law, and my pronouns are she, her, hers.
In this episode, we'll discuss the 19th Sunday after Pentecost, also known as Proper 24 or Lectionary 29, which this year falls on October 16th. For this episode, we have one content notification for you. During the deep dive, we briefly discuss harassment as retaliation.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
For our deep dive this week, we are diving into the justice system with our special guest, Professor Sally Frank, who is a professor of law at the Drake University School of Law, teaching primarily in the legal clinic with a clinic that focuses on family law and guardianship cases. Over the years, Frank has served on the boards of the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU of Iowa, the North American Board of the Union for Reform Judaism, and the North American Board of Women of Reform Judaism, among other groups. She also frequently serves as a legal observer at protests and sometimes represents protesters wearing her National Lawyers Guild hat.
Welcome!
Thank you.
We are so glad to have you with us.
Glad to be here.
Yeah. So you are a law professor, you run a legal clinic, you've been a legal observer. Particularly, I met you through you being a legal observer during the 2020 uprisings in Des Moines. That is a lot. How
Yes.
do you navigate all of those different hats?
I try to, it depends what you're doing. The nice thing about being a faculty member is that being involved in the community and doing community service is part of what, university faculty members are expected to do. Now, I take that probably in a different direction than many, but I feel it's part of who I am and what I believe in very strongly, to be out there for protesters and to support them. I would say summer of 2020 was quite exhausting, though.
Yeah,
I imagine.
Emotionally and physically.
Yeah. That was a lot of being on call kind of at a moment's notice. I remember times where we were like, we have to get someone here to be a legal observer right now. Thankfully, it was summertime, and so Drake Law School was maybe not in session, which probably helped a lot with that.
Well, I was still working. I'm on a 12-month contract because my clients' cases don't stop in the summer, but definitely a little less intense than during the year.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm curious how the different roles inform each other. Like, have you found that, I mean, obviously they're all connected because they're all connected through law stuff. Are there ways that they kind of inform how you approach the different roles?
Well, for instance, in my seminars, I look at not only in the law school one, in the women in law, I look at not only what the law is, but okay, how would you litigate this? How would you, so I bring my clinical perspective into it. And I actually do a second week where I look at history, because I don't think you know where we are if you don't know where we've been. And I include some biblical notion, biblical rape law, biblical inheritance law, because those are the issues that it's dealing with are still issues we struggle with today. And then in Women in the Hebrew Scriptures, there's parts where I'm looking at the law part, there's the story elements and then there's the law elements. And so those kind of go hand in hand. And I think especially law and Jewish observance or Jewish religion, the study is very similar. Both take a perspective that every word has meaning. And if a word is there, you have to figure out why the word is there and analyze in very careful text. And so that you find people who leave the law to be rabbis, people who leave the rabbinate to be lawyers, because the way of looking at things has a similarity to it, or the way of analyzing things.
Interesting. Okay, so I have to ask, because it's one of my favorite stories in the Bible. The daughters of Zelophehad, Mala, Hagla, Milcah, Noah, and Tirzah. Do you use that? Because that's been cited in law cases. Then it's Numbers 27, I think, is where it starts for how we name the books. But it's been cited in legal cases, right?
Yeah, I do teach that in that history, 2,500 years of history in an hour and 40 minutes.
Sure.
We skip generally from biblical. I have one Maimonides text, and then we go to the 1800s. But the daughters of Zelophehad are part of that to show inheritance law. That is still the question today. I mean, the way I understand it or teach it is every society has to have a law about what to do with your stuff when you die if you didn't leave a will.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
That's basic to organizational society staying organized and not
Yeah.
in chaos. So everybody's got to have it. And what they did is they changed the law. And then when we look at it, I mean, women in the Hebrew scriptures, first of all 5 daughters are named. There's so many
Yeah.
unnamed women, and each of them are named twice.
Mm-hmm.
That's significant. And also how they make the argument. And this is again where the lawyer in me
Mm-hmm.
looks at it. They don't tell Moses, hey, you're mistreating us, we're being treated unfairly. They look at it from Moses's perspective and maybe from God's perspective of what's important. That's how they make the argument. But also, what wonderful role models. Here are
Mm-hmm.
5 women who saw a problem, didn't fight with each other, came together, went in front of everybody, crafted an argument that would be one that Moses could hear,
Mm-hmm.
and changed the law
Yeah.
in a society that
Sure.
was so patriarchal. So I think they're role models, and it's a story that often is not noticed, but
Absolutely.
it's
Yeah.
it's a fantastic story. I love it.
I love it too. I particularly love, and the thing that when I've preached on it or taught on it, is they could have just gone to Moses on the side and tried to get an exception, and they didn't. Instead, they recognized that if it was an issue for them, it was also probably a larger issue, and so they went for a big scale change in the actual law to include them.
And the other piece of it, there's the follow up story. I kind of view it as 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But, it's hard to keep change permanent, hard to
Mm-hmm.
keep all of the progress one makes. And also, though, looking at it in its time where you didn't have phone, you didn't have internet, you didn't have cars, how many people from another tribe, if they lived in like the middle of the settlement, would they have come across? So, while, and the second piece, I guess, for the listeners, Moses says yes, or God says yes, daughters can inherit if there are no sons. And then because of the way property rights were, if they married, any of these daughters married, the property would become their husband's. And so the tribe was worried they'd lose some of their tribal territory. And so then it's amended to, but they have to marry within their tribe,
Mm-hmm.
which is disturbing. But also, how many people outside their tribe were they probably having much contact with?
Yeah.
They weren't going driving 2 hours down the road. So it probably isn't as bad as it would be today, saying you can only marry within this set group of people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sure. People use the word justice in a lot of different ways, and I imagine the way that it's used in a religious context is obviously very different than the way that it's used in your professional context. Although, of course, in your professional context, that does kind of mix. But what do you think of when you think of the word justice?
I think of it as equal enforcement of the law, but with mercy and consideration of the reality of people's lives. Compassion, mercy. There's the Anatoly France quote, and I'm not going to get exactly right, but the law treats rich and poor alike. Both rich and poor are banned from sleeping under bridges, stealing a loaf of bread. To me, that's not justice.
Yeah.
Sure.
That kind of formal equality, where, of course, the rich don't need to sleep under bridges and steal a loaf of bread. So it's got to be understanding the reality of the people in front of you and filtering that through the lens of justice, so that they're combined justice and mercy, justice and social welfare. Not saying necessarily that the poor person should be always get their way. I mean, there are texts in Deuteronomy and in Exodus, certainly, don't show favor to the poor or the rich.
Right.
But context matters.
Yeah. We talk about that a fair amount on this podcast of like, okay, so this Bible passage or this verse, but you have to look at it in the context. You have to look at the larger picture to understand what is going on in the larger scope of the story. And you have to do that with people.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Who is this verse talking to? Who is this person in this verse talking to? That kind of thing.
Yeah.
And, what did the person shoplift? Why were they shoplifting? Are they a rich person who's out for thrills? Are they anybody and they're shoplifting a pack of gum? Or are they poor people who are shoplifting for the necessities of life?
Yeah.
There's a scene in West Wing where Dr. Bartlett comments on that when she's talking to the lawyer when they're dealing with President Bartlett's getting censored. And she says there's an old story of the guy who breaks into a pharmacy to steal medicine for his family, and, a life is saved, a window's broken.
Yep. We've talked on our podcast before with Pastor L. Dowd, very involved in the uprisings in St. Louis. And so we've talked to her specifically about the injustice of the criminal justice system, connected with her to prison abolition. Mm-hmm. But as a lawyer and one who is like very much enmeshed in the criminal justice system, I'm curious what big struggles you've noticed in the system and maybe how they've changed during your career or haven't.
No, I don't do a lot of criminal law work except when it's low-level protest cases, but I have heard it reframed as the criminal legal system as a way of terming it. So we're not in the way we're even talking, saying that there's justice there. So I've found that I've been for many years looking for words, and it's like, okay, criminal legal system, that works so much better. I think the racial disparities are still the biggest issues, from the drug enforcement, from the pretextual stops. And now, they're promoting guns, but let Black people start getting the guns a lot. And that I'm kind of like, if the Black Lives Matter people had guns, then maybe they would change their view of the Second Amendment.
Right.
The original gun control laws came out after the Black Panthers were protecting the citizens of Oakland from the police.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah.
So that kind of racial disparity and the class issues, as you start criminalizing homelessness, again, though that is truly problematic, but in terms of people's everyday lives, and that's one of the big reasons why the need to legalize marijuana or decriminalize marijuana, because that's what they, always say, oh, well, then I smelled marijuana, and so therefore I had to search the vehicle. And courts no longer accepting pretextual stops would really help. Should I define pretextual stops just so people?
Yes, definitely.
Okay. So pretextual stop is where the police stop a particular motorist, not for the reason they're saying. So let's say you're driving 1 mile an hour above the speed limit. If I'm driving 1 mile an hour above the speed limit, I am highly unlikely to be stopped as a white, older woman. However, if we talk to people of color, they'll tell you that even 1 mile above the speed limit, they regularly get stopped. So, or how many people get stopped for failing to signal a lane change? Probably only people of color. Yeah. So it's things that they normally would not stop the general motorist for, but they see it's a person of color driving. Let's see what we can find. And they say that's the reason. And as long as there's a legal reason, the courts will uphold the stop, even if it's pretextual, even if they know that the real reason was, well, the police aren't going to admit, well, I stopped them because they're Black. The police are going to say, I stopped them because they failed to signal a lane change. And generally the courts will accept that. So that's what pretextual stops are. Part of what impacts the way the courts view this is because it usually comes up after the police have found something and you're bringing the exclusionary rule. You're saying they shouldn't be able to use it because it was an illegal stop. So the judges don't see the hundreds or thousands of motorists who are stopped and nothing's found. So they don't really, they're seeing, well, here we know you're guilty and we're pulling it back. That makes it harder to enforce. And it's very hard to sue a police officer. So suing them over the pretextual stops when nothing's been found is also difficult.
Yeah.
And in a way, you'd think that the stops where nothing is found is more important, obviously, because those are the ones that characterize what that's all about.
Right.
It reminds me of the story of the engineers analyzing fighter jets coming back, I think, during the First World War when we were using airplanes for the first time. And they looked at the fighter jets coming back and made a map of all the places where they were getting shot up and wanted to put armor on those spots. And somebody famous, I don't remember who it was, commented, no, that's not where you put the armor. You put the armor on the rest of the plane because that's where it got shot when those planes didn't come back.
Yeah.
And then they realized, putting more armor where on the axle of the propeller and where the engine is, that probably does make sense now that we think about it. So,
Yeah. Yeah, and what happens though is in Iowa, for instance, they are not required to make a record of every stop. They don't make a record of the race of the people that have stopped, so it's very hard
Mm,
to document. Whereas in the big stop and frisk case in New York, police were required to make a record, to make a report on
mm,
every stop they did, and including if it could be identified the race of the person stopped and some other things. So it was easier to show that most of the stops did not find any guns and did not, find anything criminal, and that way disproportionately it was people of color who were being stopped. But if you don't keep the record, you
right.
can deny the problem. And in Iowa, they've been very constant of not keeping the records.
yeah, you only count what counts.
And if you don't share the record, it doesn't help either. And I was just reading an article the other day about the vanishingly small number of police departments that share their statistics with the FBI like they're supposed to.
Yeah.
Hmm, that's a whole other.
In Des Moines, there have been efforts, at least through the city council and things, to require the police to keep those records, and that has not, I don't believe that's passed. So they're still not even in Des Moines keeping those records.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you've named some things that would be helpful to change in order to make the American justice system be more just. But I'm also reminded of Captain Sullenberger, who had a famous moment of landing a plane safely on the Hudson when an engine gave out. And he used his 15 minutes of fame in that moment to get the finger tabs put back into the flight manuals in order to make flying safer for everybody. And it was a noticeable moment of someone realizing, oh, I have this small window in which I can do something, and deciding to use that. And I think that was kind of the first time that most of the American public realized, oh, that is a thing that you could do if you did have 15 minutes of fame. And so I was wondering if you had a moment like that where you had 15 minutes to try to make one change in the American justice system, what do you think that would be in order to make it more just?
Right to counsel in civil cases.
Ooh,
Ooh.
sure. Okay.
I do a lot of divorce work, family law.
Oh,
And
yeah.
part of why my clinic does a lot of family law is because there are only 3 free services for family law in Polk County, and even fewer outside. There's legal services, there's the Polk County Volunteer Lawyers Project, and there's us. And none of us take a lot of cases.
Sure.
And the need is enormous. The Supreme Court, Iowa Supreme Court, has tried to help by creating forms. And
Mm,
when lawyers create forms for people who don't have lawyers, we're thinking of every if, and but. There are
yeah.
70 pages of instructions on how to
Yeah.
use the forms. And I'm not criticizing that because the lawyer in me is like, well, we really have to tell them how to use it. But the basics, I did an exercise with some students. We had a 1 week interim class on current issues in race and the law, and I did an access to justice piece, and it was for credit, so we had to have some assignments. And so I had students find the pro se form. Pro se is representing yourself. The pro se form for financial affidavit, and fill it out without using the computer programs that help you fill it out. And I was like, do not submit it to me. I don't want to know what your finances are. Then write me a reflection on how usable it is.
Yes.
There's the instructions. And and everybody was like the same I am as when we have an opponent without a lawyer. It's basically useless.
Mhm.
People don't know how to fill it out. It does. You want net pay? Well, people have to figure out their taxes. Try that. Try doing that without a computer program.
Mm,
And then you've got housing court, and there might be defenses to evictions, but people don't know what they are.
yep.
And there's just all over there. You have a right to counsel in that they can't force you not to appear without a lawyer, but you don't have a right to a free attorney. And of course, in the
Right.
criminal, we don't really have a right to a free attorney either, because the state requires that the public defender's office be reimbursed for that free attorney.
I didn't know that. I had someone who works as a public defender for my misdemeanor from the protests, and he did it pro bono, and like the fees got waived or whatever. But yeah,
The,
that's
the application for a court appointed lawyer includes a paragraph saying that you understand that you're going to have to pay for it, which to me is totally counter. They do have to make at sentencing, or when even if you're acquitted, you're supposed to have to pay for it. So they do have to make an ability to pay determination for, they can insist, but it's still, you know,
yeah.
you have a right to court appointed attorney at state expense, except it's not at state expense. And then you get to pay rent for being in the jail.
Yeah.
It's the one place you won't be evicted from if you refuse to pay your rent.
Right, you'll just be there longer. Yeah. I have folks in my house who have been doing guardianship stuff, and so the right to counsel in civil cases is like, oh my gosh, that would have made a huge difference. Huge difference.
Well, our clinic does represent people filing for guardianship, and there the protected party does get a court-appointed lawyer if they can't afford a lawyer. Not the person filing, but the person
whose rights are about to be taken away.
Yeah.
So our gospel reading for this episode has to do with this very persistent widow who finally wears down a corrupt judge into actually doing justice. And ideally, judges are supposed to intentionally do, or at least rule with justice. That doesn't feel like reality right now, as I imagine maybe resonates with you. It seems like with all of the like partisanization of the courts over the last decades, in my head it started with Roe v. Wade and has happened since then in response, but maybe not. Judges doing justice, especially on like when you get up into like the district courts and the appellate courts and the Supreme Court, it seems like less of a focus for the judges. I'm curious what your experience has been.
Well, I remember years ago, Justice Scalia said at a forum when a student asked him if justice was done in a case where obviously the student did not feel justice was done. He said, "My job isn't to do justice, it's to interpret the law as written." Now, one could say that he could have said, when you interpret the law as written, that is doing justice, but he didn't. So I don't know that judges feel that that's their role to do justice. I think the closest they come in terms of lower courts would be in sentencing, where, again, let's get that person who shoplifted bread and they're starving. The judge might give a very different sentence to that person than the rich person who's just having a thrill.
Yeah.
And that's where they would see circumstances and things like that should come into the picture, or more equity proceedings like child custody or things like that. But I think the courts, especially our current courts, are looking at cases way too narrowly. When they, on police, on a lot of the criminal law stuff, the search and seizure, they have no reality. They seem to have no reality of what it's like for a person to be dealing with the police and what those pressures and things are. And so the formality of it and the giving the police qualified immunity and other things. I'm hoping with Justice Brown now there, having been a public defender, that might help a little bit. Those are sometimes a little less politicized. And if people realize the reality, bringing the reality of people relating to the police may have some difference on some cases. But I think they view their agenda as what the world should be, and they have an agenda, and it certainly is not in line with what I think you and I view as justice.
Yeah, and I would hope that people setting law would not make their decisions based on what the world should be. But I was always taught that when you make policy, when you make rules that a whole bunch of people are going to follow, you have to account for the worst possible option and the folks who will try to twist the rules to their own benefit or to someone else's detriment. And so I would hope that there's some awareness of that.
I would hope so. I mean, what we saw last term certainly seemed divorced from reality, or very cryptic and very tight reading of pulling out only what history supports a particular point of view and ignoring all other history, and even not only ignoring it, making fun of it and saying how, giving it no respect.
Yeah.
So, on a lighter note, I was wondering if you've ever seen any fictional portrayals of, or I suppose non-fictional portrayals in documentaries or something, of the modern American justice system that were especially accurate or just got the general feel of things or the general vibe right. Or are there any fictional lawyers who have no business being lawyers?
There's a lot of fictional lawyers who shouldn't be lawyers, but
yes, I'm sure.
The ones that I think are closest actually use trial transcripts. So the trial of the Chicago 7 used the transcripts of the trial of the Chicago 7. I won't say any justice was done there because the actual trial is what radicalized me. I was in 5th grade. I had an assignment to watch the news every night, And I always view him as the Chicago 8 because I include Bobby Seale. But, hearing about a black man bound and gagged in a courtroom for complaining that Washington had slaves just did not jive with my fifth grade civics.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
very much shaped me. And the next year, and the other really good movie, again from her transcripts, was the Inherit the Wind, which was about one of the first trials of the century, of the 20th century or 21st century. Well, anyway, of the 1900s.
Sure.
Which was when a teacher was prosecuted for teaching evolution in Tennessee.
The Scopes trial. Yep.
The Scopes trial. And I've been tempted, like during Banned Book Week and after all the efforts of the legislature to ban teaching truth, that we need to have a public showing of that movie.
Yeah.
The movie, again, the in court stuff is from the transcript, and they changed the names, but it's Clarence Darrow against William Jennings Bryan. And so, kind of the people who shaped me, I wanted to be William Kunstler and Clarence Darrow. And so then I have worked with the ACLU, and I was on their board for a while, and I represent protesters like Kunstler. So I've incorporated those two into my work, but they very much shaped me. I kind of like Law and Order, except I get very, very frustrated that they make it seem like it's hard to get a warrant, and they make it seem like it's easy to suppress evidence, both of which are untrue. So, but the actual courtroom questioning and things like that can be somewhat realistic, cross-examination and things.
Yeah, interesting. I saw something on Twitter, and like of the top 15 shows on prime time right now, all except for like 2 are some version of like police, crime, FBI show, which is really bizarre.
A lot.
There's usually a bunch of medical too.
There was some medical, but like the top whatever. I was really surprised by that, and I was like, well, we are like all obsessed with it, but
I usually like those. I don't watch the FBI ones, but I do like the police procedurals and the medical procedurals. They just
you don't spend your time being like, that's not how it would be.
I do a little, but and this told me I was good for law school too. My mind thinks in issues. So when I was when I was 10, 11 years old, 12 years old, I'd watch, for instance, Ironside, and they'd do something. I'd say, but he has the right to remain silent. Or they're violating his rights. Of course, it took law school to figure out how the court would not recognize that they're violating their rights. But I would be sitting there arguing it as a pretty young.
That's fantastic. I do that with medical shows sometimes because I've worked as a chaplain, and so I'd be like, that's not actually how people die. That's not how it works.
Yeah.
So this is a bit random, but I noticed when I was doing some prep work for this episode that you took on the Princeton eating clubs when you were at Princeton. And my housemates and I are desperate to know, first off, what is an eating club?
Okay, so essentially it's kind of like fraternities, except you don't live there and they're only for upper class. Not only economic upper class. They're for I realize that was a kind of
although
pun
if you're
there,
at Princeton,
for juniors and seniors, you join your sophomore year as a social member, but still eat at the university. But junior and senior year, you have your meal contract with the club and you socialize. Part of the initial formation was in the 1850s, the commons burnt down. In the early 1870s, some students were expelled for joining secret societies. And so then the oldest club went to the university and was like, there's no commons. Let's see, can we do this? And the university approved them forming these eating clubs. And I think they're essentially precursors to fraternities.
Sure.
Fascinating. That's good to know. Not at all what we were like. We were trying to think of like, is it the place like you go to eat? Is it like eating contest competition? Yeah.
It sounds like a sort of a takeoff on the British gentlemen's clubs that were so common across the pond.
Yeah. Similar to the Yale secret societies and the Harvard finals clubs. But essentially you eat all your meals there and they do socializing there and partying. Especially when I was there, the drinking age was 18. So, even more partying.
Sure.
But it kind of formed in this ahistoric manner where the university was barring fraternity, secret societies, which I think were fraternities and sororities. And so then this came up as an alternative. Now, where you can't expel students for joining fraternities and sororities. There are some underclass fraternities and there are some sororities. You got to also remember that Princeton was all male undergrad until 1969.
1960. When were you there?
76 to 80. So
So it's right
I
in that
got
first.
there in the 7th year of coeducation, 7th
Wow.
to 10th.
Sure.
Yeah, so it was still very, very freshly integrating gender.
And the ratio was, I think it was 3-to-1 males to females, because at first when they decided to go co-ed, they promised the alumni they would not reduce the number of men admitted. So they added women, bought a hotel, built a dorm so that they could house the new people. And but it was very male ratio.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious what that was like for you so very early on in your, I mean, clearly since 5th grade, you have like noticed this, I would say calling, I don't know if that's the language you would use, to like legal process, justice, lawyering. But I'm curious what it was like for you so early on to be like fighting in Princeton at like as a student and like with all of this litigation. And yeah.
The hardest part was while I was a student, because
Yeah.
I viewed it as a political issue that one could argue and debate about, especially when I first brought it in my junior year. There were some people who were quite offended, sometimes drunk. And, if looks could kill, I would not be around. And wisecracks and all kinds of, there were petty harassment, more serious harassment. Much easier after I graduated and was still litigating it, because then it was, when things happened, things would happen and I'd have to be intensely about it. But once nothing was happening, I could ignore it.
Yeah.
It's hard to ignore it when you're on campus. I would joke that I was like the filler story for the school's daily newspaper. But somebody would say, "Oh, I saw you in the paper again." And I'd look and I'd think, "Why am I in the paper? Nothing's happened." And there'd be an article. Still nothing, no word in the Frank case.
Sure.
So the filler story, I feel like, okay.
If there's no news, then we report on the lack of news in your case.
Yeah. It is a daily paper and it's for a smaller university. So, you do have to come up with stories every day. But
yeah.
I started it when I was a week before my 20th birthday. So when I was a 19-year-old junior, I finished it as a law professor at Drake. It took 13 years to fully complete.
Wow.
As I was reading about it, the now Princeton has like 11 eating clubs instead of like the 3, and women are presidents in most of the clubs, or a significant number of the clubs, which has only happened recently since there was a big pushback because somebody used your name or your likeness or something in some terrible thing, and so then the women were like, no.
At one point, there were 17 clubs. When I was there were 13. 8 were non-selective, which my sophomore year meant waiting in line to sign in. And then it was a horrible weather and really freezing and not safe. And so then they went to computer lottery for if they were oversubscribed. Then there were 5 selective clubs. And of the 5 selective clubs, 3 were all male, including the oldest 2 eating clubs. And so they've reduced to 11 now, but I only went after the 3 all male.
Yeah, and they like, some of them were like, nope, we're not going to do it. And yeah, it's fascinating. It's also fascinating to me that like your Wikipedia article, all it has aside from like the brief like biostats is this case. Like it doesn't recognize any of the other work that you do, which,
well, if anyone wants to fill in more,
I think
I would feel funny writing it, so I don't feel like I can.
How do you cite yourself in writing the Wikipedia article?
Yeah.
So, out of curiosity, of the 2 eating clubs that have disappeared since your time there, were any of those from those 3 that you were prosecuting?
No.
Oh.
So 2 of the 3, as I say, were among the most prestigious and the oldest of the clubs. The other one had more of an Animal House vibe to it.
Sure. John Belushi at Princeton is an interesting picture, but okay.
And generally, while the case was going on, when reporters would ask me to characterize the clubs, I would off the record suggest to them that they look at this side of paradise, the book, This Side of Paradise, which has characterizations from the early 1900s of the clubs. And I said, didn't change. So you can sound nice and literate, quote This Side of Paradise, and I'm not characterizing them.
Sure.
That's fantastic. I'm curious, obviously 13 years is a very long time, but also especially as a junior, a 19-year-old junior, there's a like those are such formative years for folks. How did that impact the direction your life took, or did it? I guess it doesn't. Your life was kind of already like geared towards law and legal system, but
Well, I don't think it really, there are little things that I somewhat jokingly call it. I think I have Wild Bill Hickok syndrome, which isn't a thing, but uh, I I went to one of the clubs when they had a party for people planning to try to get into the club, and I was the only woman. And they were, if somebody asked me now if they should do this, I would say no, don't do this. But I was 19, and I got
Sure.
beer poured on me from behind, and some threats, and then a beer poured on me again from behind, and so I don't like to sit with my back to the in a restaurant or something with my back to the rest of the restaurant. I like to sit with my back to the wall so I can see what's coming at me.
Sure.
That's why I call it Wild Bill Hickok. For those who don't know, he was shot in the back at a bar. So
okay,
that's how he was killed. So things like that. But in terms of my life's work, I think it's given me a bigger platform and, some recognition. More people know who I am. And it's reinforced my view. And what I try to tell other people if I'm speaking about it is the kind of people think you can't fight City Hall. How often do we hear that kind of a phrase?
Yeah.
And my view is one person can make a difference and you can fight. You need support. I couldn't have done it alone. But,
Sure.
this is an example. I saw something that was wrong. I decided to attack it and, and I won. And there are no more all male eating clubs at Princeton. So if people can use that as a telling them they can make change also, then that's
Sure.
important, I think.
You can fight City Hall. It just might take you 13 years.
And we had a pseudo bat mitzvah for it when it turned.
I love that.
You can either cry or laugh. So, I just.
Yeah.
That is frequently, yeah. Oh my gosh. I love it.
Doesn't the person being bar mitzvah pick a Torah passage for that? Did you pick a Torah passage for this case?
No, essentially what we did was very few people tended to come to services Saturday morning. And I brought the food you'd have after a funeral. I brought some food and we all had that. And I marked that it was 13 years old now.
Nice.
That's fantastic. I really love that. I also love and we talked about this a little bit in last week's episode with Katie Hall, who's a nurse, and the like heroification of people, and that instead of it meaning their lives are actually like disposable for the greater good, which is what we've done a lot in the pandemic, especially. But this idea of like returning to that space of like, yes, one person can make a difference and you need support, right? But that instead of lionizing Martin Luther King Jr., right, saying, no, there's a whole group of people. And so to like have a smaller scale, but also very impactful thing of like, no, look, like this is a actual real life example of someone who saw injustice and took it on and won.
Sure.
And like real people can do that.
Yeah.
Then as we dive into our readings, so our first reading is Genesis chapter 32, verses 22 through 31. Jacob wrestles with someone all night and demands a blessing from them to allow them to go free, only to discover that the person is a divine messenger who blesses Jacob with a new name, Israel. So this passage has a lot to do with like wrestling, and I have always, I think, seen it as like a lot of a wrestling with God and like not really clear what all is going on. But then I was talking to one of my housemates, Susanna, about it, and she talked about it as like a coming out kind of wrestling, or like a wrestling with your own identity. And it reminded me of this episode of the show Love, Victor, which is a like spin-off from the movie Love, Simon, which is the movie based on the book Simon and the Homo Sapiens Agenda by Becky Albertalli. But it's like Victor is this kid and he comes out to his mom Isabel, and she has to wrestle for a while and finally hits the point where, like, I don't know, maybe it's the like whack on the hip socket of the priest like telling her other kid that Victor's going to might be going to hell, right? But that's the point where she like finally is jolted into like, oh no, this is like, if I'm going to support my kid, I'm going to do it full force. But she has to have this like time and space to wrestle and figure out what it is. So yeah, I feel like that's a lot of like the legal system is wrestling too.
There are a lot of different interpretations that I've read and heard. Weirdly, the week that's the Torah portion, there's also the story of Dinah, and I almost never hear sermons on Dinah. I much more frequently hear sermons on wrestling. But
Yeah.
it's a much easier story to get your hands around. But generally, when you're looking at it, is he wrestling with himself and his conscience? Is he wrestling with it's by a river? And certainly ancients often thought of demons in the rivers, even to the extent of now we have the Loch Ness monster. But water's a dangerous place, and he's by a river there, so it could be that kind of demon, it could be an angel, any number of those things, his conscience. And so you can spin on any of those and get meaning from them and what that means to be wrestling. What I really like in the story is that his name is changed to Yisrael, which means one who wrestles with the divine. And that's what the Jewish people do. We have always been wrestling with the divine, wrestling with the text. What does the text mean? What meaning can we take from it? How do we approach it? And okay, God, you've told us to wrestle with you. We don't take it as just God said X and that's it. We take it as, what do you mean? How should it be? And so and of course, as a social activist, if I can wrestle with God, and this is why I like the Abraham story too, right? If I can argue with God, I can certainly argue with humans, with human leaders. They have much less authority than God. So both kind of give me the permission to, not that I would need it, but it reinforces.
Yeah.
When you look at Noah, it says Noah was righteous in his age among his generation. And one of the questions asked is, does that mean he wouldn't be righteous in a different age? Or, or then again, being righteous when nobody around you is being righteous, even if you're not, is pretty hard. So, I mean, you can take that in different directions, but there's this rabbinic explanation that compares Moses to Abraham and says that he wasn't as righteous as Abraham because God told Noah, I'm going to kill everybody, build an ark. And Noah says, okay, cool. And he goes ahead and builds the ark. Whereas God tells Abraham, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham argues with God over it.
Yeah.
Now,
and then Abraham just gives up, right? Like, that's the thing. It's like, God's like, yeah, okay, fewer people, okay. And then Abraham's like, okay.
Well, 10. And that's where we get a minion from. That for communal prayer, you need 10 people because otherwise you don't have community. But yeah, he more gives up when he's told to sacrifice Isaac.
Yeah.
But I just like this notion that we understand these texts as saying there's nothing wrong with arguing with God.
Yeah.
That's what we should do. And as I said, if I can argue with God, I can argue with Biden. I can argue, never in person, of course, but with Obama. I can argue.
Well, if you got the opportunity,
Yeah. But I mean, these are earthly people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do. Like, that's one of the things that I think I have always known and valued in like Jewish interpretations of scripture and like in Judaism itself is this like willingness, and the Psalms do a great job of this, right? Like to call God out on things and to lament to God. I mean, Fiddler on the Roof style sometimes, and also on like just a more personal level.
Yeah.
When I was looking at verse 28, when the person says, you shall no longer be called Jacob, but Yisrael, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed. And I also was like, oh, a name. I noticed that too, but it was like, oh, a name change. Like, look, it's biblical. It is, in fact, and this comes up in other places in the Bible too, but like having a name and knowing a name is a really important and powerful thing. And having this space of like recognition and affirmation of the change of a name is a really cool thing for me as a non-binary person, even though I don't plan on changing my name, but like to know that there is this evidence in Scripture of name changes as good and holy things.
When you've got Avram and Sarah, Sarai also changing to Abraham and Sarah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and speaking of names, then I looked at verse 29, which says, Then Jacob asked him, Please tell me your name. But he said, Why is it that you ask my name? And there he blessed him. And I have to say that the first thing that I flashed back to when I read, Why is it that you ask my name? Was Clint Eastwood in his various so called spaghetti westerns. The director Sergio Leone made few westerns in Italy because it was cheaper to film there, and so those got nicknamed the spaghetti western. I believe there's three of them that make up a trilogy, and I've seen all of them at one point or another. With, let's just say, there's a little varying quality going on there. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is a fair amount of fun, and the other two are less fabulous. But in those movies, Clint Eastwood's character does not have a name. He gets nicknamed by various people for various things, but he doesn't ever actually tell anyone his name. That's because these movies are actually based on Japanese movies in which the character doesn't have a name for reasons related to Japanese culture, I believe. So I find it kind of hilarious that Jacob, sends his family across the river so that he'll have some alone time, but then God's messenger shows up and ruins the alone time, and then the messenger and him wind up wrestling for reasons we're still not exactly, it's not clear who started that, and then Jacob tries to extort a blessing out of him when he's winning, and then finally he wants to know this messenger's name before the messenger leaves, and only after all of that does the messenger bless him.
Yeah, that's a lot.
That seems like a lot, and also not like Jacob was making a good argument for blessing him. I don't like that. None of those actions would have induced me to bless someone or made me more likely to bless them. It would have made me slightly less likely,
Well, Jacob's character is quite problematic kind of throughout.
Yeah. Jacob's character is a problem.
Yeah.
But
when you talk about the name, when he asks the divine creature the name, there's Maimonides' view that anything, if we gave any name we give God or any description we give God is while as humans we need to, it's really inappropriate because it limits what God is. And if we say God is X, then that limits. Sure. And the name we do have, there's like 70 different names for God, at least in the Bible or tradition. But then the Moses name, when Moses says, "What's your name?" It's a completely weird. It's a verb. Yeah, asher, yeah, which essentially means it's, I think, the future imperfect tense or something like that. I am who I am. I will be who I will be. That's not a name, it's an action in essence, which I then, instead of Lord, I use the eternal because I think that has that essence in it and is not gendered. But so there, but then we just had Yom Kippur, and one of the God's names is Harachamam, the God of compassion, and that one comes from the Hebrew word for uterus, so it's a female oriented name, but there's at least 70.
Yeah, I frequently use the everlasting as opposed to the eternal, and I have friends who use the becoming God, the becoming one. But I like that because I don't know if we've talked about it explicitly on the podcast, but that Lord comes from intentionally not pronouncing the name, and so it is a replacement name. But in Christianity, it has become so ubiquitous that it's just like everywhere,
and so specifically linked to Jesus in particular, which
is its own kind of problematic.
Yeah,
and that connects to like the political dynamics of who was Lord in the Roman Empire, but
not that Christianity has had great, etiquette when it comes to Jewish people, but in the first place,
it does make it a little easier for Jews to say there's no gender with God because we don't have a human manifestation. But
yes,
yeah, and Christians are just like, there's no gender with God because we can't math. Like 3, 1, 1, 3. We can't math. It's okay. Or at least that's what some of us say. But
so now for our newest segment, Let's Make a Muppets Musical, where we take the passage that we've read and talk about who would be a good casting choice, whether Muppet or human, for this passage. Emily, did you have any ideas to start us off?
Well, I think, Sally, you had a brilliant idea.
I would do Esau, who is Jacob is getting the guts up to meet Esau, and this whole section we're looking at Esau, his brother, as Oscar the Grouch, at least as depicted in the Bible.
Yeah, that makes
Yeah.
so much sense to me. I love Oscar the Grouch. I had, when I was a kid, a little Oscar the Grouch stuffed animal slash puppet. I'm not exactly sure how that worked, but I do remember some sort of puppetry with it. But I loved Oscar the Grouch, and I love Esau as, like, because it is, like, and he has every right to be, like, real grumpy with Jacob, who, like, snuck out the blessings and birthright. So I love.
Yeah, I don't know if we're supposed to assume this, but I guess I always figured that Jacob would have had more of a hand in, the writing the Bible down part, and history being told by the victors. I never really thought that Esau's story was given to us quite as shinily as Jacob's side of things.
Absolutely.
So there are 2 wrestler Muppets, apparently.
Okay.
I just Googled because I thought that I had remembered Muppets wrestling. Apparently it's from Elmo the Musical. But there's 2 wrestlers, a brown wrestler and an orange wrestler, who have, like, full on, like, the wrestling costumes that are, I think I associate with, like, Mexican wrestling. So they could be
excellent. Okay.
the wrestlers. Like, one could be Jacob, at least, wrestling with the divine being. That would probably be my guess.
Sure, I could see that. I was thinking about how the only person that sees this messenger is Jacob. And so, as far as anyone else is concerned, this guy might be an imaginary friend. And so I think that means that the messenger needs to be played by Snuffleupagus, who was assumed by so many to be Big Bird's imaginary friend until finally we realized that other people could see him. Also, I really like the idea of Snuffleupagus's trunk helping with the wrestling. I have this mental picture of him holding Jacob by the forehead and just pushing him away by the forehead, and Jacob, windmilling his arms. So
that's fantastic. I like those castings. I think yes. I usually, like, toss this out there, but usually when I cast a human, half the time it's not as one of the human characters. So we could make the human the river and just, like, have them holding the. That'd be the token human.
Sure. Someone who always wanted to be in a Muppets musical, but never really fit any of the characters.
Exactly. Exactly. So, Sally, any other thoughts on life, the universe, and everything?
I think we've got it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being with us. This was
Thank you.
Such a great conversation and a great space to nerd out about both the criminal legal system, the legal system in this country, which I now have new language for, and scripture in, like, really fun ways.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it as well.
Our second reading today is from 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 14 through chapter 4, verse 5. The author reminds Timothy to keep his teaching of the faith based firmly in Scripture, despite the many distractions that are likely to arise.
So one of the themes that came up for me in this passage was the idea of consistency, right? The author is talking about Timothy keeping consistent in sources and the rooting of his faith. And I always think of Great British Baking Show for consistency, because they don't actually care as much about consistency as, like, the author of 2 Timothy seems to care.
When it comes to the performance of the bakers?
Yeah, like, they don't care that you're consistent over time. They just are focusing on that 1 week. And they don't care if you are consistently terrible, as long as you're a cis white guy. They'll still keep you in.
The one thing that they are consistent about, though, is that if the focus of the day is not on something that is within their, usual purview, they are consistently terrible at talking about things that are not in the ethnic background of the hosts. Let's put it that way. Because so far, they have managed to insult Jewish baking and now Mexican cooking, because somehow they apparently thought that tacos were baking in a recent episode. And Paul Hollywood's cookbook did not understand what chalo was, famously, and also misspelled it.
Challah?
Yeah. It
Wow. I
it
didn't
was
know
a
about the
bit of a brouhaha.
cooking, the cookbook, and I have not seen the most recent season yet, but I did see a bunch of memes about the like
Tacos.
companies do company
Like,
diversity,
I
equity,
think you
and
could
inclusion
call,
groups during Latina month, and then
yeah.
it had them doing Mexican baking week.
Like, if they wanted to have tortillas as a baking challenge, that seems fair. Like,
Yeah.
that is, a bread. Sure, absolutely. But they decided to go full out and do tacos, and also, like, no one there, I guess, knew how to do tacos. And, oh, gracious.
Like you could even do tacos as a baking challenge as long as the like baking part is tortilla.
Sure. Or, like,
I don't know.
I've known people who have baked enchiladas.
Mm-hmm. Oh, there's
You
plenty
put
you
them
can
in a pan
bake
and you can
in
bake them. And,
Mexican
yeah.
cooking. Like,
But, like, that is not how. Anyway,
yeah. So
moving on.
consistently ethnocentric. Don't be consistent like that.
Right. And so in verse 14 of chapter 3, we read, "But as for you, continue in what you have learned and firmly believed, knowing from whom you learned it." And, sometimes continuing as you have been taught works out well, but sometimes a little variety is not a bad thing. This made me think of Darcy Lewis from the MCU. One of the fan theories about why Darcy is still an undergrad student in her early 20s is that she has been in school consistently all that time since she was 17 or 18 whenever she graduated high school, but that she has
Mm-hmm.
changed majors several times. And when the first Thor movie starts, she is a political science major, but the idea is that she's had several very different majors before that. And often in fan fictions that give her that background, it is that breadth of experience and knowledge that allows her to deal with the melodrama and often supervillains that are thrown her way. So, like, even if it seems like your learning has not really had a particular aim or goal, that doesn't mean it's not going to be useful.
That is true. That's my I triple majored in college and am better for it as a pastor and a person. So I agree. And then in verse 16 we read, all scripture is inspired by God. And first off, we have to ask ourselves, slash, we should ask ourselves, I guess, what
Sure.
does this even mean? Right?
Yeah.
Inspired does not mean God's exact dictation, right?
Right.
Sally Frank's work inspires me. She is inspired by her Jewish faith, which is inspired by God, right?
Sure.
I think of it, I like the thing that came to mind when I was thinking about like what is inspired by God was actually like in The West Wing, the episode Take This Sabbath, which is the episode where somebody is about to be executed and they're trying to get the president to pardon him or commute the sentence or like stay the execution, sure, basically. And it's like all of these different ways that like potentially God is trying to inspire, right? From rabbis preaching to priests talking to old school bullies, all of that there's like all of these different ways that God can inspire things and people, and for good and for bad. But I mean, ideally God is inspiring for good, but it can manifest in ways that we like and ways that we don't.
Yeah. And also, just because you say that someone else has inspired you to do something, that is not the same thing as the other person asking you to do it. Like, the guy who shot Reagan said that he was inspired by Jodie Foster's appearance in a movie, and she, was not in that movie telling anyone to go shoot a president.
Yeah.
That was not part of the movie.
It also does not get you off the hook if you incite people to violence.
Well, yeah, no.
That's a different thing.
Inciting and inspiring are two different things. But inspiring is usually, like, being inspired is all on your side. And the other person, like, may have done something that you felt it called you to do something, but that's entirely your interpretation. Yeah, I looked at that same verse, which is a little longer than what Emily read. All scripture is inspired by God and is useful for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness. And I looked at the second half of this verse, and I thought, maybe not in that order. Teaching and training seem like a good start. Absolutely. Scripture is totally useful for both of those. I'm not really sure why they were separated in the first place. But you do have to have like a relationship. You have to do some of that teaching and training and do it well in order to get the respect that you need from your students in order for the reproof or correction to like do any good whatsoever, right? In order for it to have any weight. And so I think I would list reproof and correction last on the list of useful things that scripture can do. And also I think like this list is not exhaustive either, but it made me think of a couple of fairly well-known movie teachers, including Mr. Holland from Mr. Holland's Opus and John Keating from Dead Poet Society. And what both of them were good at was forming a relationship with their students, and then what they said carried some weight.
Yeah. I mean, I think teaching, like, you teach the basics and then you train, you practice, and you go over it. And that's how I was thinking about it. So reproof and correction are part of the training. But yeah, I haven't seen Mr. Holland's Opus in a long time, and I love Dead Poets Society. I have that on VHS, I believe.
Sure.
And then in chapter 4, verse 3, we read, "For the time is coming when people will not put up with sound doctrine, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own desires." And aside from the itching ears part, although like there's a like, if your ears are burning, someone's talking about you, maybe, I don't know.
I have to figure there's a cultural idiom there that we are just missing.
Yeah, that's what I was assuming, but I did not check.
Come to think of it, this would have been a really good verse for me to look at my copy of the Jewish Annotated New Testament about, but unfortunately that's in a different building.
Mine is just out of reach, so I could not. But it does sound familiar, right? Like this, when people are not putting up with sound doctrine, when they're just finding teachers to suit their own desires, and it's happening everywhere. You and I talk about it a fair amount on this podcast, and it's like something that we all have to be aware of. And so like one of the keys to knowing that you are not them is to pay attention to what you're leaning into, right? If you're leaning into the discomfort and the challenge to yourself, but also looking for consistency, as stated before, consistency in the core message, where then it's like an easier, oh, okay, yeah, this is clearly faithful because it is consistently pushing me in these ways out of my comfort zone towards more kindness for others, that sort of stuff.
Sure, that makes sense.
Yeah. I think there was a Buffy episode where everybody got tricked. There are a couple of Buffy episodes where everybody gets tricked, but like where they got tricked into following. Buffy did. She got tricked into this like dream nightmare world thing as if she were in a psychiatric ward, and like trying to convince her that her whole life had been a made-up psychosis. And there's a lot of like problematic things about psychiatric wards, but there is this like, it was the path of least resistance for her to think that, than to like be present in the hardships and the struggle against evil. So yeah, she had to figure that out. And then our gospel reading for this episode is Luke chapter 18, verses 1 through 8. In a parable, Jesus tells of a widow's persistence, which wears a corrupt judge down into finally granting justice. Though justice is often delayed, God's justice will not be denied. So one of the themes in this passage is persistence. God, just like the widow, is persistent, and the work of justice is a work of persistence, whether it is debt forgiveness or marijuana legalization or de-gender segregating eating clubs at Princeton. Persistence is important.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then in verse 1, we read, "Then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart." And this reminded me of Rogue, the movie Rogue One, the Star Wars movie Rogue One. Chirrut Imwe is the like monk type character, and so his like mantra thing feels like a praying always. I'm one with the force is with me. I'm one with the force is with me, as like constant prayer. And it's persistent, and it does wear people down.
Yeah, I've met those people too. And then in verse 2 we read, "He said, in a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people." It's almost like loving God and loving people are tied together somehow. Like maybe there are several passages in the Bible, including an especially long one in 1 John, that make the point over and over and over again that loving God and loving people are tied together.
Weird how that works.
Yeah, it's like, the Bible is trying to make one point over and over again over the course of thousands of years.
Yeah, it's like we're stubborn and take a long time to learn things.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then in verse 5, we read, the judge says to, I think, themselves, "Yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice so that she may not wear me out by continually coming." And this reminded me of Encanto and Mirabelle in particular, the ways that in her life she has to persist again and again against the exclusion and the ignoring of her by her family, that she is kind of pushed to the side and viewed in some ways in very shameful ways, and yet she persists. And it is in fact that persistence that is a gift that saves her family and the town, which is really cool.
Yeah.
Yay, Mirabelle.
Excellent. And then in verse 7 we read, "And will not God grant justice to God's chosen ones who cry to God day and night? Will God delay long in helping them?" And so I just want to make the point that whining and yelling at God is not only allowed, but is actually, in fact, encouraged by the Bible. God wants to talk to you, and God wants you to talk to God, and God is totally okay with some of that talking being negative when necessary. That is fine. And God is not Tom Cruise in A Few Good Men. God can always handle the truth.
I'm pretty sure Tom Cruise could handle the truth as well, just not in Jack Nicholson's estimation. But I love that scene. It is one of my favorite scenes ever.
Misconduct in the Navy, perhaps. About misconduct with Scientology,
Fair point.
Yeah. So, thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the 20th Sunday after Pentecost. This podcast has been produced by us, Kay Roloff and Emily Ewing. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut guest episodes and interviews, live Q&As, and more, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. It's cheaper than a lawyer and cheaper than a phone call from jail.
Yeah.
Because capitalism sucks.
Yeah. I mean, I'm pretty sure that supporting us is also capitalism, but...
I mean, is it? There's like the regular trade of goods and services is not necessarily capitalism. The taking advantage of people who are stuck in jail and have no other options feels more like.
Also, let us know on Facebook or Twitter who you would cast for Let's Make a Muppets Musical for this episode.
As the ancient Christian said, Pax Vobiscum.